Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Jonna Perrillo, Associate Professor of English Education and also the Director of the English Education Program at the University of Texas at El Paso. She's the author of a new book titled Educating the Enemy: Teaching Nazis and Mexicans in the Cold War Borderlands. In this book, she compares the privileged educational experience offered to the children of relocated Nazi scientists in 1947 El Paso, Texas, with the educational disadvantages faced by Mexican American students living in that same city. So before I hand it over to Dr. Perrillo, I want to remind you that if you have a question, please just put it in the chat and we'll try to answer it later today after the presentation. So welcome, Dr. Perrillo.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me to be here and for that really warm introduction. I'm really excited to be talking with this group tonight and thanks so much of this organization. I want to say, I'll just set out a roadmap for where we're headed for the next bit of time. I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk about what the book is about. And I'm going to talk a bit about how I came to the project and how I wrote it. And then talk about why I think it's important now. The story is important now. And that's even really changed since I finished writing the book, because our political context is changing so quickly in some ways, particularly when it comes to education. I also just want to say before I get started that I really love audience interaction and talking with the audience, or at least answering questions that you all put out. So I really encourage it and don't want to take up too much of the time talking. I'll talk about for about 45 minutes with the hopes that we'll have plenty of time to have some kind of semblance of a conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. So before we start, I just wanted to make a note of key language that I use and that might provoke questions for folks. And let me just say, Sarah, you're looking at my PowerPoint, is that right?
Yes, we see your PowerPoint.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure, because now that's all I can see too. So if you're making gestures, I wouldn't know it. Okay, key language that I use in the book and that I'm going to use tonight. So I use Anglo-American and white American somewhat interchangeably. They weren't as interchangeable at the time, but Anglo-American obviously being a regional word with specific context that captures the sort of white supremacy at the heart of this story. And then I use Mexican and Mexican interchangeably as well for slightly different reason. They were used a little bit interchangeably at the period. And we think that 17% of Mexican heritage people in El Paso at the time this book takes place were Mexican born. The rest were, the great majority were American citizens, El Paso born, probably American citizens. But nevertheless, that difference didn't always mean a whole lot to Anglo-Americans, as we'll talk about tonight. More controversially, I want to address the use of the word Nazis in the title, and the fact that I refer to the paperclip children as Nazis in the title for two reasons. First, it seems really important to me for us to continually remember they were brought here specifically because of their father's work for the Nazi Party, which I'll talk a little bit more in just a minute. But they weren't just Germans. They were the children of Nazi servants. And secondly, I think the term better captures, again, the white supremacist project that's at the heart of this story, both in terms of the U.S. government's arrangement with war criminals or potential war criminals. They got out of being called war criminals because of their invitation to come to the United States. But also in terms of the El Paso Public Schools reception of the children and the white supremacy that was at the heart of that as well. So while I don't believe that any children are responsible for their parents' views, I also think it's disingenuous to refer to them as German. And in the book, I largely refer to them as the paperclip children, which I see as a happy medium. So in 1945, in one of the first acts of the Cold War, the US War Department raced against the clock to outpace their Soviet analogs to recruit scientists, 118 scientists who created the V-2 missile for the Third Reich, to build an American weapon under a program that would come to be called Operation Paperclip. The site for them that was chosen for them to conduct their work was at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. And the team of German scientists, Nazi scientists, started to arrive in late 1945. But to make the operation successful, the War Department and the US Army realized very early on that they would need to be able to bring their families. And so each scientist was allotted 4 family members, although many brought more. And those families started to arrive in El Paso in late 1946. And what we're looking at here is a picture of some family, mothers and children, arriving off of a train. First, they took a boat to Hoboken, New Jersey from Bremerhaven, Germany, and then they took a train across the country. And actually, even these 2 travel experiences were really important sites and experiences of race formation and privilege for these children, which I talk about in the book, and I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. But the important experiences happened on the boat and on the train. So here they are arriving, and they lived in El Paso at Fort Bliss for 3 years until the group was relocated to Huntsville, Alabama, first to move to a larger military, or what was seen as a better military arsenal, Redstone Arsenal, and then to build NASA. The entire time that they lived at Fort Bliss, they lived in old hospital barracks that were reconditioned into group homes for them, and that were surrounded by barbed wire. And the children themselves were bused by military police to El Paso public schools daily. In this way, they actually had more interaction with Americans and the American public than their parents did. But in the most basic way, the book, Educating the Enemy, my book asks the question, what did it mean for the children of fascists to attend public schools in El Paso? And how did this experience shape or change them? And even more importantly, what did their presence reveal about El Paso schools and about American society? And that's really the question most at the heart of this book. So here we're looking at 2 photographs from 1947 of first grade classes. One at the Alamo Elementary School. It was called a Mexican school because every student who attended it was Mexican or Mexican American. And the other, a first grade class at American school, Crockett Elementary. And American meant that Anglo children attended that school. So the paperclip children were immediately assigned, the bulk of them, to Crockett Elementary. They were assigned to other Anglo schools as well. But Crockett Elementary figures large in the book because it took in the most students. So the paperclip children arrived at a moment when democratic education was a major impulse in American education. This idea that American schools were the place where children were going to learn post-war skills for democracy. But they also came at a time when schools were, as we can see here, racially segregated, marked by education inequity, and really shaped by a patriotic curriculum that, as I talk about in the book, heralded white privilege and achievement, and often was more inviting to the paperclip children than it was to Mexican American children, who comprised over half of students in El Paso. So yeah, from this nomenclature, which, I mean, those of you who have attended other talks focused on Mexican American experience in schooling in this time know that this was pro forma nomenclature across the Southwest at this time. It wasn't unique to El Paso, but from it, I argue that it reveals much about how schools conceived of the relationship between schools, race, and citizenship. both in terms of how schools saw the children in their midst, but also how they envisioned their responsibilities to these children. So from these differences in terming schools as Mexican and American schools came a number of other differences and inequities, including really important material differences in resources and in building conditions. All teachers across the city, with the exception of 17 out of almost 600, were Anglo. So it also meant that it shaped teachers' relationships with parents and the communities that they taught quite differently. And just the level of the most expert teachers and the teachers with the most say in their placements, for almost all of the time chose to teach at American schools. So the fact that the paperclip children were assigned to these American schools is just the first way in which the children of Nazis were treated by El Pasoans, Anglo Pasoans, as more welcome and more potentially American than actual American citizens. So at the same time, the paperclip children were exploited, and here I use the term that the military used for their parents. The Army talked about exploiting the scientists, but in fact, the children were exploited to testify to the power of American public schooling and American democracy. The argument went that if the children of Nazis could be made into Democrats, anyone could. And so because of this, I argue in the book, they were actually the most important members in the operation, if ones that have been little known to date, because they made the operation palatable to Americans. They reflected back to Americans what they thought happy white children were supposed to look like. And in that way made the operation far more comfortable or palatable to the American public, starting with the El Paso public. So they sold newspapers. For example, here's a picture of Henry Chinkle selling newspapers at Fort Bliss. And they held birthday parties. And they did things that happy, privileged, economically comfortable children were supposed to do. Here we're looking at a map of El Paso schools. And there's just a couple things that I want to point out about it. So in the book, to make this argument about the ways in which paperclip children fundamentally revealed the undemocratic nature of American schooling, I start by looking at school assignments and school populations. So here we're looking at a 1946 map of El Paso schools. And in the book, I chart the differences between schools on the south side of this bold-faced line here. So this is all called South El Paso, south of this line, and north of it is called North El Paso. And south side, close to the border, was the more Mexican-American part of town. And the idea was to keep Mexican-American students on the south side of the line. So this was a little bit trickier to do than for African-Americans, all of whom attended a school called the Douglas School, which is in South El Paso as well. But obviously, Jim Crow didn't apply to Mexican Americans. So here's where local school policies took over. And in the book, I quote from a guidebook that I found that said, students could only transfer from South Side to North Side schools if they were Anglo, and they could only transfer from Anglo to South Side schools if they were Mexican. And why is this the case? Well, the schools on the two sides of the line were fundamentally different. So school buildings on the South El Paso were so overcrowded that students took classes in hallways and auditoriums. They attended school for only half of a day. In many cases, they could lack libraries and cafeterias, meaning that they offered no lunch programs. When parents at Burleson, which we're looking at, which I can point to right here, Burleson complained that their students were taking classes in hallways, and that the Dudley School on the north side of the line, which was newer to begin with, had gotten improvements before they did. The superintendent, A.H. Huey, called them communists, and walked out of the room. So there is a real tradition of parental advocacy and activism in the South Side, but they were up against a lot. And so this is just one really important way in which schools shaped politics in the city. So what I'm really trying to show here is that school segregation wasn't just a product of neighborhood segregation, the way arguments sometimes frame it as, but it was in fact a distinct and purposeful arm of race and class hierarchy in El Paso. And just one other thing that I'll say before we leave a map behind is Bowie High School was a product of parental activism. Parents organized in 1908 for their own high school because their students weren't allowed into El Paso High or Austin High School. But you'll see how many schools feed into Bowie as compared to how many fewer schools are feeding into two high schools in North El Paso. So another way that I think that I look at school and city politics and here in the politics of segregation is just looking at public space more largely. And so here we see a picture of a paperclip family, the Chinkles, who are enjoying the pool at Fort Bliss as compared to the Armijo swimming pool in South El Paso. And I'll just read for everyone. I know that you can read for yourselves, but I'll go ahead and read this quote that I'm going to comment on in a second, that Helga Chinkel, her memories of the pool actually echoed that of a lot of other people that I interviewed for the book. And she said, we'd make a daily trek to the swimming pool where we'd mix with the American soldiers who also lived on the base. They were very friendly to us, and I remember getting tossed from one to another through the air. So this stood out to me when she said this, both because I thought it was a really interesting comment on like these people that she's surrounded by and who are ostensibly tossing her through the air are most likely veterans, people, right, who had just fought in World War II. And so that stood out to me, that sort of immediate assimilation, which wasn't across the board, was not shared across the board. There are other moments in the book where soldiers are at Fort Bliss and seeing the V2 scientists in the mess hall or getting escorted to a theater off base and saying things like, it seems like they have the run of the place, or this made me really uncomfortable. But nevertheless, the children actually remember feeling really pretty integrated and warmly welcomed. This is an important moment too, obviously, because these soldiers are white soldiers, right? African-American soldiers were only allowed to use the pool on base the day before it was drained, much as they weren't allowed to use the pool in Germany. That the American military had set at the lieutenant's headquarters there either. And so this very experience is a reminder to us of the sort of race lines around which the city operated and how the students, the paperclip children's lives were shaped by these race lines, even at a military base, as soon as they got to the United States. And then I include this picture of the Armijo pool, actually, because I love it, and it's a place that that I have some association with. And that I think it's important to remember that these segregated places could still be places of joy. And then the other thing that I look at in terms of thinking about space and race are housing and housing policies, including racialized home loan policies that were meant to, again, contain the city's Mexican-American population to the south side of the city. And those of you many of you may be familiar with Hulk maps. There have been a bunch of really good books written about them in the last decade or so. The Homeowner Loan Corporation, which surveyed American cities throughout the 1930s and marked areas as from dangerous to highly desirable, that these categories were highly associative with race and the racialization of these cities, and worked to deprive people of color from earning home loans and being able to invest in their cities. And Mexican Americans were seen as much like racial minorities in every other city, according to these Hulk reports, as a drain on the system, as bad renters, as lazy and dishonest and as in need of careful watching. So my goal in looking at the ways in which students' housing worked, and this is a picture of outside of the barracks of the paperclip children, as I say, reading comic books. The idea here was to look at how El Paso's entire civic and economic structure both stemmed from and informed or supported unequal schools. So I spend the first 2 chapters of the book looking at the ways in which this race and space works, but also how the school curriculum mirrors, or school design more largely mirrors ideas about Western civilization that the scientists made when they were being vetted for coming to the United States. They would make arguments about how the United States was the heart of Western civilization and that they wanted to help fight for Western civilization. And I look at how the curriculum further informs these ideas and echoes these post-war and early Cold War ideas about Western civilization. And so to do so, I look at the humanities curriculum, starting with civics education and a series of units that El Paso teachers wrote on cowboys and Indians. And here I argue that both in school and in juvenile culture more largely and nationally, children were taught that the settling of the American West constituted a heroic narrative of white achievement, one that from which both Mexican Americans and Native Americans were largely erased, and in which genocide was largely overlooked. And so the effect was to teach young white Americans that the nation's settlement and that their own position in society was the result of a host of civic virtues, including independence, industry, and loyalty, that white children easily learned in school. They learned it more easily than other children did, rather than from a history of violence and conquest. I was just struck by the fact that Henry Chinkle still had this drawing from 3rd grade at Crockett Elementary. And I thought it was actually interesting too, because it's a little bit atypical of what the curricular units that I studied emphasize. So here he's got Native Americans looking down on settlements with guns. In fact, much of what was taught when Indians were taught as a type in the El Paso curriculum was that they were the forebears to a different kind of landed person, the cowboy. And that they taught the cowboys a number of ways of relating to the land, of peacefulness, of working in community, that both absented them within the curriculum themselves. Cowboys became the focus, and Indians were, relegated as vanished or invisible people. But and as a result of that, they often focused on particular kinds of indigenous peoples and particular kinds of indigenous practices in the curriculum. And I can say more about that later if people are interested. But there's also a complete absence of vaqueros, for example, in the curriculum, even though in this region, in El Paso in particular, they were vital to teaching Anglo cowboys what they knew. So the paperclip children remember cowboy culture very fondly and thought of it as really important to them, an important part of their assimilation. And here we're looking at a few different pictures. The first is of a rodeo parade that the children were brought to. This is a group of paperclip children with their mothers. The other is Henry Chinkle with rope. I talked to about 20 different former paperclip children, but he had a personal archive that I'll talk more about a little bit later on. And then this is a picture of Burn Sealer and his brother with his father at his first, that's them in their barracks in their first day in El Paso. And they remember quite fondly the ideas of cowboys and Indians and the ideas of frontier mythology. And it made just a really appealing argument for them, in part because they were already familiar with it from Germany. Germany had a real affinity for American stories of the American West and of cowboys and Indians. And so the children grew up in homes that often had books by Karl May, for example, who was a writer, a German writer who sort of fashioned himself into a James Fenimore Cooper type, even though he hadn't visited the U.S. until shortly before his death. Buffalo Bill show made many, many trips to Germany. And so they were just very familiar with this. Also, while they were waiting transport to the United States, the American military, they were in a part of Bavaria together, the families waiting transport, and the American military would show them Western films as a way of both keeping them busy and helping prepare them to come to the United States. So the American myths of the American West worked as a really powerful assimilation tool for them, both because it was such an important part of juvenile culture here, but also such an important part of juvenile culture in Germany. And then here we have a picture of Johann Schinkel, who's the father of Henry, Walter, and Helga. And I was just really caught by this caption that someone wrote on the family photos: father assimilating himself in Texas. In fact, a number of the children remember their parents being, their fathers in particular, being kind of disappointed when they came here that people weren't walking around with guns and cowboy hats in the city, and that it was actually a city. So that was all about the civics curriculum. The other thing that I examined is the language curriculum in El Paso schools, and specifically the punishment versus reward system by which Mexican-American children and the paperclip children learned English. So neither of them spoke much English when they came to the United States. The Mexican children, as a sort of mirror of the segregated nature of their lives before they entered into public school. And German children, the great majority of them, out of the 144 children who came here, only 6 were old enough to even have been part of Hitler Youth. A great deal of them had no education in Germany before they came here and really didn't speak English. So for one of the most important things that teachers needed to do with both groups of children when they entered into school was to teach them English. And as anyone, in El Paso growing up at this time could tell you now, the ways in which Mexican-American children were taught to speak English was through corporal punishment, through beating, slapping, or otherwise punishing them when they spoke Spanish in school, even on the playground. And that was just school policy, and that was not unique to El Paso. So this is a pretty commonly known story. By contrast, we're looking at pictures of summer school that children receive, the paperclip designed for the paperclip children in the summer of 1947 between their spring semester and their fall. And here they were taught English by a number of volunteer teachers. And in contrast, they were not beaten, but they were given ice cream for not speaking German. So this is what I mean by a punishment versus reward system. It's a really different concept of bilingualism for the two children. And it led to a narrative of the children's enthusiasm for English and easy acquisition for English that then translated into visions of them as more studious, quick, and enthusiastic learners, and therefore more natural Americans in the making. And this was an argument advanced by the American press, as well as by the children's teachers and parents. I talk a little bit in the book, too, about Spanish instruction, which Anglos at this time, Anglo parents demanded. There were many experiments in El Paso since really right after the turn of the century, the 1910s, with Spanish instruction, but it really reached a new height at this time because as the Mexican-American and Mexican population was growing in the city rapidly, Anglos started to fear that they were going to lose out on good jobs, including, for example, management jobs of workers who were Spanish speaking. But these two booklets, which were very common in El Paso at the time and were given to me first by a woman named Gwyneth Garrison, but which several other people said that they recognized their grandmothers having, I think tell us a great deal about the terms in which Spanish was meant to be used by Anglo-Americans, right? And it was really a language of power more than progressivism. The last chapter in the book is about a woman named Ilse Axter, who was really the most controversial member of the group. She was a Montessori teacher in Berlin until Hitler banned Montessori schools in 1936, and then she went to work for the Nazi Party. She fell out with one of her Montessori co-leaders, who ended up dying in Auschwitz, in part because of Ilse Axter's cutting her off from the Montessori movement. So I'm really interested in her because, well, she was very important in the group and reminds us that women and family members were important to the operation of Operation Paperclip. But also because she is someone who both believed in progressive education theories and retrograde or regressive ideas about race simultaneously. And what I try to work out in the chapter is A, how this can be and what it means for these two sort of ideas to coexist. And then B, what that tells us about American schools, which held some of the same fault lines, right? So progressive education in the United States, as across the globe, was often sort of interwoven with really conservative or, again, regressive ideas about race. And so I end the book with her as a way of looking back on the kinds of decisions that American teachers made, their role in upholding American racial policies, and in fact, their roles in many ways in helping to create or further racial policies, and doing that in part also through designing curriculum, right? Not just through the schools in which they taught. So this starts to get to at how I wrote this book, which is through a lot of oral history, which I'll talk about the reason why in just a few minutes. But two of the people that I interviewed were the grandchildren of Ilse Axter. And so Lily Axter, who lives in Berlin now, for example, said, she lives in Vienna now, said, "I'm not at all afraid about my grandmother's name to be dragged through the mud. Ilse Axter was a heavy Nazi, and there's nothing that should be held back, no matter whether she was involved in the Montessori movement." And then her brother, Felix, who does live in Berlin, said, "What I want to say, I don't doubt that my grandmother was terrible. At the same time, I, my brothers and sisters as well, began to question her function within our family memory. Blaming her was a way for my grandfather to whitewash himself and his Nazi entanglements." And so I was really appreciative of Lily and Felix. They talked more openly about Nazism and their family's complicity in Nazism than probably anyone else I interviewed, though they weren't totally singular. So I really appreciated their candor and what they were able to offer and what they were able to teach me about their grandmother's experience. She, I should say, and her husband were one of a few people that were not offered American citizenship in 1955. The rest of the group became American citizens within 10 years of arriving in the United States. But in these conversations also showed me how this is both a story about local history and about one very particular place, but also resists geographical containment, right? That this is a story that ended up having resonances and connecting with and connecting back to places far outside the United States. So here we're looking at two photographs from an article called Democracy's Children. And so I don't know if this is going to work quite as I had thought it might, because I can't see the chat actually while I've got my screen open. But maybe Sarah, I don't know if you could help me out. I wanted to just do some archival work as a group for a minute and ask folks to type into the chat what you notice, what details stand out to you about either of these photographs. And Sarah, if it's possible, would you mind just kind of reading some of what you see in the chat?
Yes, no problem. If anyone has anything they want to share, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm just even asking for factual details in terms of what stands out to you about, you could think about how they're composed, about what's in the foreground versus the background, who's in it.
I think we have a shy audience. If anybody, oh, here we got one. One person is saying that they've split the boys and the girls, and that
Yes,
one photo is happy white German kids playing, only white children.
yes, both photos, in fact. Yeah.
Yeah, and that the images are gendered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great observation.
Well, I will just point out the perspective. It looks like the photographer got down on the ground to take that photo of the boys. And so, sort of, I don't know, maybe that photographer kind of getting closer to
Yeah.
them. Oh, and we've got some more comments here. Girls wearing saddle Oxfords. Another person says that the affluence is implied, and also that the boys are more down in the dirt. And yeah.
Terrific. Yeah. This is what I noticed too. They're similarly dressed, right? Like when we talk about their affluence, we talk about how they really look remarkably similar to each other. And I noticed too, like I love how the ball comes out of the frame in that first photo, but also just that's Crockett Elementary behind those girls, and just such a prototypical school building, mid-century school building. So yeah, all of these things stood out to me as well. As someone already pointed out, like who isn't in the picture, right? That everyone in these pictures are white. And again, this article was a really important early campaign, part of a press campaign that was organized between the military, schools, and the El Paso press to write the narrative of these children, right? And so which girls are German and which are American? On the playground, it made no difference. That's the argument that all of these articles came down to, is that when you take German children out of Nazi Germany, they look just like American children. And so when I started to write this book, and when I first started to think about the paperclip children, I assumed it was going to be a story of political anxiety, because here were enemy children in a town that has a strong military presence, one of the largest army bases in the nation. And these pictures quickly showed me that if there was anxiety, there was a great deal of work being done to quell that anxiety. So I first learned about the story of I learned about Operation Paperclip before I saw these pictures, but it never occurred to me that these scientists had children. And when my first sort of realization of that was looking at this book, one of these local history books that some of you all may have seen of your own neighborhood. This is of my neighborhood, and of these children. And this is what helped me to go back and find that article. I don't want to take a lot of time with it right now, because I have more that I want for us to look at in the time that we've got. But I would just say one thing that does stand out to me is how much the text in this book echoes that argument that I was just talking about, that the German children were like the Americans. So I'll just read the first caption real quickly to show you what I mean. In the winter of 1947, the year before Principal Alicia Swan retired, she received a phone call from Louis M. Godfrey, who was the counselor for the German scientists and their families who were relocated to Fort Bliss after World War II to conduct rocket research. Due to its location near Fort Bliss, Crockett seemed to be a good choice for the 90 children who arrived in April from Germany. Since many parents, relatives, and siblings had fought and died in both world wars, many concerns arose of how locals would receive the German children. Some of the German students never attended school, and 2/3 couldn't speak English. By the time the new year began, Swan's fears were put to rest as she stood at the entrance and watched all 936 of the American children, including the German students, whom she knew by name, walk through the door. And so there's just this sense, again, this sort of reiteration that the German children fit right in, And after a, sort of moment of hesitation, were warmly welcomed. And I think that this story really deserves and merits, and in fact, requires interrogation, and for us to think a little bit more deeply about that assimilation experience and what it meant, and who was allowed to assimilate and who was not invited to assimilate in the same way. So another challenge that I faced beyond these sort of like what I could document through these, through the documentation did exist, was the erasure largely of the children in the archives, which is not totally atypical because children often are. But for example, in the 2 trips that I made to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., in the near month that I spent out there, in what is probably enough files to fill on Operation Paperclip to fill my dining room, there was almost nothing about the children, despite the fact that a great deal of resources were spent on getting them here, and that we know that they were important. And so that's why I turned to oral history, which I had some training in from graduate school, but hadn't really ever planned on doing myself. And just having to sort of capture these stories in other ways. And so I did talk to about 20 former paperclip children, and fewer Mexican-American El Pasoans, though I did interview a good number, but there's already an existing oral history collection here at my university, the University of Texas at El Paso. We have a pretty amazing oral history institute that also interviewed people who were children at that time, a long time ago, like further back and closer to their experiences as students. And so I drew on those as much as I could as well. But even when children are represented in archives, so oftentimes, whether it's through teachers' writing or education policy, or even school newspapers, their experiences can be mediated by adults. And so these oral histories allowed me to recapture, with 70 years of time, elapsed, which I understand is not a small thing, at least what their impressions were. And they also opened up for me these sort of personal archives of information and documents and photos that are not in any public archive anywhere. So here we're looking at Henry Chingle's report card from Crockett Elementary, I think from his first semester here, which is just a really sort of amazing thing to find. And then Walter, his younger brother, who commented on their experience and said, "Now, we German kids, we were admired for being smart. Not all of us were, but we all, I think, almost without exception, we did well in school. At least all the friends I knew among the German students all did well. So we were branded as smart." And I've had really interesting conversations with Walter since the book came out about what it's like to be at the center of a book in which your life is at the center of an argument about political systems and about racism, and just what that experience was like for him and a few other people. And he said, like, there are things that he could only see now that he, of course, couldn't see then, and in fact didn't think about before he had read the book. But he was an example of someone else who just these impressions and understanding that he was seen from a position of privilege was incredibly helpful to open up other lines of questioning for me. So as I said, when I was talking about the Axters, it could be hard to talk about race, and it could be hard to talk about Nazism. And there's a great deal of silence around this now, and there was a lot of silence within the families around it. We know that that is true for German people more generally. A lot of historians have captured this. So one of the things that I had to do when I was writing the book is sort of negotiate between what my interviewees would or could not tell me, particularly when it came to race and fascism, and then what I could document in other ways. And then I also had to figure out like how to push back on some of the things that they did tell me, and to think about how I could push back on them in other ways. And again, I can talk more about that later if folks are interested. but I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk. So in writing this book, my goal was really to gather a deep understanding of how closely schools and school policy exists in the borderlands, but also beyond. And I argue that school shapes the experience of being American for all of our nation's children. And I think that we can find it especially difficult to wrestle with the fact that these experiences can be so different and fundamentally unequal from one group of students to another. So, and we don't often know what to do with these differences. And so I end with this photo, again, from this one article, Girlish Secrets Know No National Barriers. In fact, the German girl in this photo, Barbara, didn't speak English at the time that this photo was taken, her sister told me. And for her, the entry was a little bit more traumatic than for most of the people with whom I spoke. And so that's just a good reminder of the ways in which this picture is a construction. But to go back to what I was saying just a moment ago, we often try to teach history, and we're in a moment right now that's deeply invested in conservatives treating history as if it's a secret, right? To deny these factual truths and to deny where we come from temporally. And in the book, I'm trying very much so to sort of bring that to the surface, to tell the story and to reckon with what does it mean for this to be the story of, or a story of, El Paso schools. At the same time, I received this email from an African-American woman named Lorraine Fells in New York, after an article in Time magazine came out about the book. And she wrote to me, during World War II, when one of my brothers was in the Army in Oklahoma, the USO came to put on a show. The Black soldiers were not allowed in and watched the show from the outside fence, while seated inside was a row of German war prisoners. That brother went on to fight in the war and earned the Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. I can almost hear his voice as he bitterly described the blonde heads of the German prisoners in their front row seats. So this email stood out to me as a reminder of how, again, this story that's so much about this particular place in this particular region and race making in a particular part of the United States, nevertheless, can speak to a much larger whole and to people who may have never even stepped foot in El Paso, but find something in this story that resonates with their own. So there are two takeaways that I just want to end with before we move to questions. First is to think about the ways in which this story directly reflects on these issues now: school inequity, school segregation. So here in El Paso, the Mexican-American student population, or the Latinx student population, is in the high 80s. And so is actually the teacher population. So we're no longer looking at a faculty of Anglo teachers teaching Latinx students. And yet, schools are not perfect here by any means. They're more racially integrated than they were in the mid-century by a great deal. But economically, they still struggle. And in terms of school privilege and the ways in which opportunities and programs and advancements get doled out also remains deeply unequal. And I've worked and talked a bit with Southside parents who are waging or fighting, I should say, a number of school reform campaigns right now that I think are really important and that coincide, I think, with school campaigns in other parts of the country, school reform campaigns. So that's one thing, is to think about how inequity has both changed and remained static over time. But the other larger story that I think, probably comes to a lot of folks' minds right now is to understand the ways in which young Americans of all types right now are living in a moment in which students and schools and teachers are once again being tested, and when democratic education is really under attack. And so, as I've argued in a number of pieces that I've written over the last 6 months for the public, the real struggle that's being waged in censorship campaigns, whether it's about critical race theory or just racism more largely, or sexuality, or now social emotional learning, is really not just about books or about the curriculum, but is a battle to continue to privilege white experience and white power, and to continue to ensure that white students' status in society at large is bolstered and made by public schools. And so, while I applaud the ways in which teachers and librarians have pushed back on the front lines of defending books and truthful history, I think we can see ever more clearly day by day that we can't stop there, and that to defend democratic education means to own our historical compromises, and our history, and to have a very clear sense of just what we're fighting against when we fight against sort of conservative movements to censor and shape public schools, and how much we're still fighting for. So I think I'm going to end things there with the hope that we'll have time to talk about other things.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have a few questions from the audience, so let me see if I can bring one of them up. Here's a question. I'm wondering if the author can expand on the comment, Jim Crow didn't apply to Mexican Americans. Thanks.
Well, yeah, I mean, so there's a system of segregation that many historians talk about called Juan Crow, which is to say that it wasn't federal policy in the same way that Jim Crow was. And in fact, I mean, one of the things that I document in the book is, for example, Mexican Americans in El Paso didn't want to go to the Douglas School for Black students, and they often made sure that they didn't. And they talk about segregation and racism within South El Paso between African Americans and Mexican Americans. When the Board of Vital Statistics, the El Paso Board of Vital Statistics, tried to change race policy in 1930s, or race categorization, and sort out white El Pasoans from Mexican American El Pasoans as a way of lowering the white mortality rate, because this was El Paso was trying to sell itself as a sort of place for people with tuberculosis and other kinds of diseases to come, and it didn't look great if the mortality rate in the city itself was very high. Mexican Americans pushed back so strongly that that it didn't change, and they remained in this one categorization as white. So race politics were really complicated, and what I mean when I say that Jim Crow didn't apply is that it didn't, and that other forms of policy came to step in. That segregation still existed, and it was often it was incredibly powerful and often looked the same, however it got there. So I tell the story, for example, in this moment of the baseball team from Bowie High School going to Austin because they competed, they made it into the state championships, and getting there and not being allowed to stay in a single hotel. Right? So when I say it often looked the same in the end, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. They ended up sleeping in the bleachers of the Austin UTA baseball field, and they won the championship the next day. And so that's a story that the Bowie community remains incredibly proud of. But other policies like school policy came to step in and segregate schools when federal law didn't. But, you know, it also meant that middle class and wealthy Mexican Americans assimilated more easily and had access to different schools and institutions than the majority of Mexican Americans in El Paso. So if I can just, one last example, there were 2 LULAC presidents in a row who came from El Paso, and one sent his children to Bowie High School by choice, and the other sent his children to the largely white El Paso High School and said, I don't get why you're sending your kids to Bowie, right? So all of these decisions were really complicated, and complicated by the ways in which racism and segregation was enforced for different communities.
Thank you. We have a question from Joey Cardenas. He wants to know, to what extent did the paperclip students come to realize that the cowboy culture was based in Mexican border culture versus Mexican Americans being self-aware of that connection?
I don't think the paperclip children came to recognize it at all. There was really no way they could. They didn't go to school with Mexican American children. The Mexican children that they went to school with, there were a handful, were actual Mexican citizens who paid the El Paso city government to cross the bridge and attend school in El Paso. That was actually allowed for wealthy Mexicans, and they don't remember going to school with these children, right? Again, there were just a handful, and it certainly wasn't taught in school. And then their lives off of base were largely contained to Fort Bliss. They were a really tight community with each other because they lived until they moved to Huntsville, Alabama, when they were allowed to live wherever they wanted, and then just lived in Jim Crow as white Americans in Jim Crow, Huntsville. They didn't have a way of coming to know this history. I think Mexican American children did. The curriculum didn't look very different in Mexican American schools just because it didn't. The same people were writing the curriculum for all of the schools by and large. But I'm sure they learned it outside of the home. Outside of school, and including in the home.
Yeah, I just want to throw out one personal anecdote because this is so interesting to me. My grandmother during World War II worked at a fig canning factory in Brazoria County. At that fig canning factory, it was almost all Mexicanos, Mexican Americans working there, except the other half of the people that worked there were German prisoners of war. Yeah. And they worked side by side. According to my grandmother, very little security. It was just side by side. Yeah, so it's fascinating.
I talked to people who remember flirting with Italian prisoners of war who were held in a park in downtown El Paso. Yeah, it's bizarre.
Yeah, okay. We have another question here. This is about your oral histories. What are some examples of subjects that interviewees didn't want to talk about?
Their parents, in some cases. This is not across the board. But I promised them that it was a book about them and not about their parents, and it really is. And on some level, I know from other forms of research that there was a spectrum of ways into Nazism for these parents. So there were people whose parents joined the Nazi Party in 1933 before they were required to, and then there were people who did not. Right, who joined it at the last minute when they were taken on to this project. There were families who the other members of the family moved to Argentina after the war. And so there are all sorts of indicators, right, that this was not like a sort of uniform group. But my thinking in writing the book is it didn't really matter what their parents did or how complicit they were, because Americans weren't making these distinctions, right? They were Nazi scientists who came to the United States, and we accepted them. And we didn't ask questions about sort of what they did or how they came to it. And this aligns with American public opinion in the period more largely, right? Americans were much quicker to say Germans were just, beholden to Hitler, or were, followed Hitler, were misguided by him. They didn't make those adjustments for Japanese people or for Japanese Americans, right? So public opinion throughout the war was really interesting. So they didn't want to talk about their parents by and large, and it wasn't worth it to me to lose the interview to push them on something that really, again, wasn't at the heart of the book and wouldn't have told me that much more about what this book was really about.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you. It's a fascinating story, and a part of El Paso history, Texas history that I didn't know about. So that's I think maybe some of us are aware that there were these Nazi scientists that were kind of in demand because of different countries competing to figure things out first, but. This idea of, well, they had families, that adds a whole other dimension to it. Okay. Well, I just want to tell everybody that if you're interested in the book, we did put the link in the chat. You can get it from the University of Chicago Press or wherever you get books, or talk to your public library about carrying a copy of this book. We also have several events coming up down the pipeline. I just want to share with you the next event we have this month is revisiting the 2019 Latino Equity Complaint against the University of Texas at Austin. If you don't know what this is about, a couple of years ago, Latino faculty at UT did some research which had some kind of startling information. And so they wrote a report, and they're going to tell us what has happened in the couple of years since they released that report at our state flagship university. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Perrillo, for joining us tonight and sharing this information with us. We love to keep learning. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, I encourage you to learn more about the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute by visiting our website. I'm sorry, I'm trying to put the website up here. Here it is, somosmacri.org. You can learn more about us, find our schedule of upcoming events. We regularly host virtual talks like this, and we are building the nation's first museum dedicated to Mexican American civil rights history. So we need your support. Please visit our website. Please follow us on social media. I hope we'll see you again, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.